If you're ready, I think we'll make a start. Before I start, could I ask how many people were here for the talk on love? All right. Well, this is the same talk in a different way. The topic for today's talk is detachment. Actually, that's not right. I just remembered. It's off a duck's back. And the subtitle is Detachment Naturally. So that's sort of the parameters. People usually see detachment as not caring. It's the common misapprehension of what detachment is. There's a lovely story about a group of students at Sydney University who realised that they could get free parking on campus if they founded and ran a student-based club. So in 1979, this is 79, those glory days, they created and registered the Apathy Club. So all they wanted was on-campus parking, right? The Apathy Club, and everything went really well. At the end of the year, they had to submit an annual report to the University Senate, and they declared that their venture had been phenomenally successful because the level of apathy during the year had been so high that no single meeting had taken place and that no one had attended, no one had been appointed as a club president, and the same went for a treasurer. It didn't matter because no one came to the meetings anyway, so... When the University Senate at that point voted unanimously to dissolve the club, the founders declared that this too was a measure of the club's success because it proved that absolutely no one really cared. And they should get on-campus parking anyway. So that's the cleverness of university students seeking to angle a point of view. But this misapprehension of detachment as not caring is a major misapprehension. Because it leads to, or is based on, the fundamental misapprehension that the opposite of detachment, attachment, is a life well lived. Now let's just have a look at this notion of detachment a little bit objectively for a minute. You really don't want your spouse doing open heart surgery on you. You want somebody who's detached enough from you to be able to wield the scalpel objectively. And it's a common court of law statement that whoever is his own counsel has a fool for a client. Because in a court of law, you want somebody who's detached. And you can't be detached if you're representing yourself. And if you're attached, you haven't got an objective point of view from which you can present the case. Now, there are an infinite number of examples where objectivity is the absolute benchmark for successful activity. Common sense tells us that objectivity is the only way by which we can manage an action from its conception right through all the stages to its execution. If you try to manage an action from an attached point of view, the attachment will block your perception. You'll only see a part of the thing. You won't see the whole picture. So the idea of detachment needs a little bit of consideration and a real inquiry into how it can be strengthened and how it can empower the individual. Because it's a mighty force. The very best moments in our lives, the best, very best, not the most exciting, not the most stimulating, the very best moments are moments when we are, as it were, removed from the event and watching it unfold in a state of bliss, quiet joy and fulfillment. They're the moments when we feel our humanness. To be engaged in the heart of the action stimulates the senses. Sure, they get excited. It creates waves of movement in the mind, sings songs of passion to the heart. But when you compare those experiences of sensory engagement, mental turbulence, and emotional movement, when you compare those with this condition of quiet, blissful, utterly enjoyable watching, there's no comparison to be made. Now, ducks. The thing about ducks is that they depend on water running off their backs. And if you've ever seen a film clip of that at work, it's actually really interesting, and you wonder how that manages to happen with ducks. But we're not here for a science lesson. We're here for a life lesson. Now, the thing about ducks is that water does run off their backs, but they live on water. They depend on water. A duck out of water is a duck out of its proper context. So the idea is that it's no good for us to live like ducks out of water. So just like detachment isn't about not caring, detachment's also not about retreating from life and living in a cave. We need to find a way to be detached without removing ourselves from the hurly-burly of life. This is the philosophical quest. Now, one thing is really, really, really beyond doubt. It'd be good to find a way to detach ourselves from life before life detaches itself from us. Because it's going to. And at that point, at the point when death comes and life does detach itself from us, we have no option but to surrender. And if we're familiar with that detachment prior to the moment when life departs, then it will make the passage from life through death to whatever something to really be interested in, rather than something to fear. So we're going to start by trying a small exercise in detachment. And to do this exercise, all you need is your right hand on your lap, or visible, so that you can see it. And if you want to hold it, leave it on your lap. Just leave it so that it's not moving. Be the best thing to do. So everything out of your hands, and your hand on your knee, palm down, so that you can see all 5 fingers. Now, the first thing is just make sure you can sit still during this exercise so that there's nothing to distract you from the practice of the exercise. So the body's comfortable, body's still. Now look at the back of your hand. The important thing is to keep the body still. Don't move your hand to see different parts of it. Just look at it. Look at it, just as it is. Start with the tip of the littlest finger. However you can see it, don't worry about moving it. Look at the nail on the end of the finger. The shape of the nail. Right at the top of the nail, its shape, any variations in it. Look at the change in colour as the top of the nail meets the underlying flesh, turning a different colour as the translucent nail plate is backed by flesh. Can you see the grooves in the nail, the vertical lines running down to the base? Look at the skin between the end of the nail and the first joint. It might be perfectly smooth, but there might be some tiny little lines there. There are certainly lines at the first finger joint. Note their pattern. And below the joint, the tiny hair follicles. Suspend all judgment here. Just try to see the finger as if it's someone else's finger. Suspend all sense of familiarity. See it as if for the first time. Move down to the knuckle. Again, notice the variations in lines and colour as you look at it. And from the first knuckle to the base of that little finger where it joins the stub of the hand and the knuckle there. Now, just gently lift the hand if you need to so you can see the base of the ring finger clearly. And look along it slowly to the knuckle. Observe the hair follicles, the pattern on the skin. See how the skin over the knuckle is looser to allow for stretch. The lines etched into the skin over the knuckle. And further along, the tiny hair follicles above the knuckle and the lines of the first joint. The slight swelling below the fingernail. The variations in the nail at its base. The small moon. The changing colour of the nail as your eyes move from the base to the exposed tip of the nail. And across to the top of the middle finger. Now gently turn the hand over so that you can see the inside of the middle finger. From the top, note the fingerprint on the pad of the finger. Can't see it in detail, but this is an absolutely unique pattern out of the billions of fingerprints that have ever been in the world. Further down, the lines at each joint, the striations on the skin, the pattern of the lines. And there at the base of the middle finger, where it meets the palm of the hand, the flesh pinched in slightly as it's gathered at its base. Now holding your hand like this, move the fingers very slowly and very gently. See how they can flex and extend, stretch out and in. Let the index finger turn in a circle. Don't force it. Just see the related movements in the other fingers in the hand. How much movement is possible in these fingers? And the thumb. The thumb has only one joint, while the fingers have two. And it's fully opposable to every finger. Watch as you stretch it across the palm towards the little finger until both gently touch. Bring it slowly across to oppose the tips of each finger, each tip. And look at how each finger dips itself to take the touch of the thumb. This is the only hand that can do this in the entire creation, this human hand, the most dexterous instrument in the world. Now holding the hand still again, looking at it palm up, slowly wiggle the fingers. Under the flesh of these hands is a remarkable set of bones, giving it rigidity but flexibility at the same time, and an infinite variety of handling. And again, slowly run the thumb across the pads of the fingers. The fingertips have the highest concentration of touch receptors and thermoreceptors among all the areas of the human skin. All of the skin, the most sensitive to temperature, pressure, vibration. Bring it up to your mouth, breathe out onto it. Feel the temperature, moisture, texture. What a piece of work this thing is. What a piece of work it is. Isn't it? Simple, detailed observation. This remarkable, remarkable instrument. They can do all sorts of things. It can heal. It can love, paint, write, It can perform the most sensitive, delicate, violent things. A hand. Now look at it another way. Let each of the fingers represent one of the 5 senses. Smell, taste, sight, touch, hearing. 5 fingers representing 5 senses, all conjoined in the hand, which represents the guiding power of the mind, the 6th sense. So represented in that thing is the entire realm of the sensory and mental world. It's remarkable. It's remarkable. The wonder of the human being represented by a hand. Now, look at the effect of simple, detailed, detached observation. So we connect fully with the senses, in this case with our eyes and then with touch. Our minds and our bodies are brought together in the same place, in the present moment. Alert to everything, instead of our minds off on some distant future venture or past experience. And in order to maintain that connection, we had to keep sorting distractions away. Now, we didn't do that, but the impulse to maintain the observation guarded against any other distraction. The other fruit of detachment is that we begin to see that we're very familiar with this thing, but we don't really know it at all. After all, it's mine. And there's the fault. It's a human hand. For a moment, we might have seen this thing, the hand, as if for the first time, just free of any sense of knowing it. The ancients used to call this practice of suspending knowledge about something that you think you know, letting go of what you think you know. They used to call this the practice of humility. A spiritual, psychological, emotional discipline to bring the human being back into their birthright as human, as a part of humanity. So one other really significant thing about this practice of detachment is the quiet joy that it reveals. So tuned are we to the excitement of the senses that moments of quiet joy often pass us by unnoticed. So tuned are the senses to excitement that when somebody wants to get our attention now, they've got to put up a 50-foot high billboard with a huge picture or letters in vast writing to grab your attention. Or use the scattergun approach of launching small video clips simultaneously across 27 different social media platforms. And throughout all of that, the experience of quiet joy, which really is the heart of a fulfilled life, just passes by. Now, wondering about detachment in this way takes us some different from the idea of just water off a duck's back. But it does emphasize the fact that detachment is a natural condition. And it can be accessed quite naturally. You don't have to remove yourself from life in order to experience and realize the value of detachment. That's not detachment. That's escape. And sooner or later, if you go and live off in a mountain cave somewhere for the purposes of detachment, you're going to have to come back down to the marketplace for supplies. And you might find that the illusion of detachment that you've established in the mountain place is shattered by just a momentary interaction with somebody in the hurly-burly of the marketplace. So the real philosophy, the real spiritual warrior, is that warrior who can walk unmoved in the midst of the battlefield, detached, quiet, effective, immediate, no gap between conception of action and execution, where every movement meets the need, doesn't seek to satisfy a desire, where every thought rises as a revelation to shine light on the present moment, rather than the inner speech of some false I who's pretending to exist. It's a different world. There's another symbol of detachment, apart from a duck, which is prevailing across all of the major cultures in the world. The lotus flower has been a symbol of detachment for the Egyptians, the ancient Persians, the Phoenicians, the Chinese, Japanese, Hindus, Buddhists. Robert Graves wrote a seminal work in the 1950s, I think it was, called The White Goddess. And he recounts a Greek myth of the half-god, half-mortal hero Hercules, who borrows a lotus-shaped golden cup of the sun. The lotus is right there, as it were a signpost for us, an example in the natural world of what it is to live in a detached way. The Dalai Lama, you may well know, is known as the Lord of the White Lotus, because of the symbolism of the lotus as detachment, but also because the colour white is made up of every other colour and is a symbol of spiritual perfection. So here you have the Lord of the White Lotus, utterly detached, but made up of everything. You get the idea? It's a lovely combination and it's a beautiful salutation. Now here's the thing about the lotus flower. It grows out of mud on the bottom of lakes and ponds. The stalks send up large green leaves which repel drops of water on the surface. Then flowers which can span 10 to 12 inches, and leaves and flowers that can tower higher than the average person. So the flowers open at dawn and close at sunset. Open to the light and close to the dark. As one Japanese poet in a haiku said, when you contemplate the waters at dawn, listen, you can hear the lotus blossom. So its leaves, they're 3 feet across when it's grown. A few of its leaves lie flat on the surface of the water, like a water lily, and the rest stand anywhere from 1 foot to 5 feet above the water. What an image for the evolving soul. It begins in the mud of all sorts of attachments where its roots are buried. Then its stalk makes its way up through murky water towards the surface. And once it's reached the air, high above the water in clear light, this unsullied blossom opens among leaves that are themselves untouched by water. And that's the story of an evolving soul, growing, as it were, in the world, but not of the world. Growing in the mud and the waters of the world, but untouched by them. And then high above them, opening to the light and closing to the dark. The Lotus Sutra is the foundation text of Mahayana or Great Vehicle Buddhism. It's sometimes called the Lotus of the True Law, and it's said to be the quintessential expression of the Buddha's true intent. So that was written sometime between 1000 BC and 200 AD. The Lotus of the True Law. Now this is a beautiful image because true law has to be detached to be true. Tyrannical law is the vehicle for the expression of a tyrant's attachments. True law needs to be detached from personal advantage. The lotus flower of justice can only blossom if the stalk is a true law. So the Buddha's foundation text, the Lotus of the True Law, speaks to both of those things, but well before the Lotus Sutra was written, well before that, the Bhagavad Gita describes anasakti yoga. Anasakti yoga. The yoga of non-attachment. The word yoga, it's been anglified, so we English speakers, because we anglify a word and take possession of it, we think we know what it means, but the original meaning of the word yoga is yoke or join, but best understood as way, the way of non-attachment. So the Bhagavad Gita is a handbook for those who would travel the way of non-attachment. Krishna, the charioteer, tells his disciple that as the lotus leaf, I think this is in chapter 14, is untouched by water, so one is untouched by the world if he performs his duty without attachment. So Mr. Kruger this morning referred to the Bhagavad Gita and encouraged reading it. When it first broke upon the West 200 years ago in a translation, it started turning the Western mind in a way that it hadn't been turned for 1,000 years. The only concomitant stimulation had come during the Renaissance in Florence, when all of the ancient Greek texts became available to the Florentines. But halfway through the 20th century, we've seen a new influx of extraordinary spiritual and philosophical influence from the East. Remarkable growth. And in a way, we're in the midst of a renaissance of understanding. So the Bhagavad Gita is a handbook for those who would walk the way of unattachment. So the way of the duck lets water run off its back but lives and moves in the water. The Lotus Sutra teaches us how dharma can regulate our lives so that we can become lotus-like in our perfection. But the Gita teaches a warrior in the middle of a battlefield how to throw himself into the heat of the battle while remaining totally detached, as a lotus leaf is untouched by water. Now, just like the lotus flower, that little exercise we did with our hands can teach us a lot. So if you look at the hand again, you could see how a finger could easily be detached from the hand, you know. Just take the index finger. You know, you just get a good pair of secateurs and snip it off, right? Then it becomes detached from the hand. A scalpel would be best. It'd be good to know to sort of go between the bones, otherwise it gets a bit sort of raggedy. And see, look at your attachment working now. Now, without a finger, even take that finger away, a hand is still a hand, and it's attached to the wrist, which is attached to an arm, which is attached to a torso. But a finger without a hand is just a dead digit. Ever seen a handless finger wandering around? There's a very funny Monty Python skit of this fellow, I can't remember which film it is, you've seen it? It's the battling, and he gets his arms chopped off and his legs chopped off, and then says, you know, come back, try again. And he's got nothing to do. So a finger without a hand is just a dead digit. You detach a leg and the torso remains. The leg is just a dead limb. And you can detach most of the moving parts from a human body and the human being still remains. You can't detach the head and you can't detach the heart. These two at least seem to be essential to being alive. Although my sister, the nurse, tells me that theoretically you could detach a head from a torso and use a machine to keep the blood circulating through it so it wouldn't rot. But you can detach most of the moving parts from a human body and the human being remains. What about these two? Human and being. Can these two be detached? Can your human body be detached from your being? Now, detach a finger. A hand is still a hand because it's attached to a wrist. Detach the hand from the wrist. You still have the arm because it's still attached to the torso. Detach the arm from the torso. You still have a torso. That's as far as you can go from the body. Go any further and you detach the body from the life force itself. Now, we're going to come back to this question in just a minute. So we've got to the life force, right? Now, what about the life force? Is that attached to something? Now, I'm going to read you something. It's a little lengthy, but this is also from my sister, the nurse. And she told me about this case, so I went looking for it. It's a case of a 3-year-old girl in Austria, in a small town in Austria in the Alps, who fell through the ice on a lake and was on the bottom of a pond for more than 30 minutes before her parents could get her out. So the story first appeared as a case report in the Annals of Thoracic Surgery. So do you mind if I just read you a bit of this? The girl and her parents had been out on a walk in the woods with their 3-year-old daughter. The parents lost sight of the girl for a moment. That's all it took. She fell into an icy fish pond. The parents frantically jumped in after her, but she was lost beneath the surface for 30 minutes before they finally found her on the pond bottom. They pulled her to the surface and got her to the shore. Following instructions from an emergency response team reached on their cell phone, they began cardiopulmonary resuscitation. Rescue personnel arrived 8 minutes later and took the first recordings of the girl's condition. She was unresponsive. She had no blood pressure or pulse or sign of breathing. Her body temperature was 66 degrees. Her pupils were dilated and unreactive to light, indicating cessation of brain function. So she was gone. But the emergency technicians continued CPR. A helicopter took her to the nearest hospital where she was wheeled directly into an operating room. A member of the emergency crew straddling her on the gurney, pumping her chest. A surgical team got her onto a heart-lung bypass machine as rapidly as it could. The surgeon had to cut down through the skin of the child's right groin and sew one of the desk-sized machine's silicone rubber tubes into her femoral artery to take the blood out of her, and then another into her femoral vein to send the blood back. The pump was turned on, and as he adjusted the oxygen and temperature and flow through the system, the clear tubing turned maroon with her blood. Only then did they stop the girl's chest compressions. Between the transport time and the time it took to plug the machine into her, she had been lifeless for an hour and a half. By the 2-hour mark, however, her body temperature had risen almost 10 degrees, and her heart began to beat. It was her first organ to come back. After 6 hours, the girl's core reached 98.6 degrees normal body temperature. The team tried to shift her from the bypass machine to a mechanical ventilator, but the pond water and debris had damaged her lungs too severely for the oxygen pumped in through the breathing tubes to reach her blood. So they switched her instead to an artificial lung system known as ECMO. To do this, the surgeons had to open her chest down the middle with a power saw and sew the lines to and from the portable ECMO unit directly into her aorta and her beating heart. The machine took over. Surgeons removed the heart-lung bypass tubing. They repaired the vessels, closed her groin incision. The surgical team moved the girl into intensive care with her chest still open and covered with sterile plastic foil. Through the day and night, the intensive care unit team worked on suctioning the water and debris from her lungs with a fibre optic bronchoscope. By the next day, her lungs had recovered sufficiently for the team to switch her from ECMO to a mechanical ventilator, which required taking her back to the operating room to unplug the tubing, repair the holes and close her chest. Over the next 2 days, all the girl's organs recovered. Her liver, her kidneys, her intestines, everything except her brain. A CT scan showed global brain swelling, a sign of diffuse damage, but no actual dead zones, so the team escalated the care one step further, drilled a hole in the girl's skull, threaded a probe into the brain to monitor the pressure, kept that pressure tightly controlled through constant adjustments in her fluids and medications, and for more than a week, she lay comatose. Then, slowly, she came back to life. First, her pupils started to react to light. Next, she began to breathe on her own, and one day, she simply awoke. 2 weeks after her accident, she went home. Her right leg and left arm were partially paralysed. Her speech was thick and slurry. But she underwent extensive outpatient therapy, and by the age 5, she had recovered her faculties completely. Physical and neurological examinations were normal. She was like any little girl again. It's extraordinary, isn't it? So the body had completely detached from the life force. But what about the girl herself? Now, one question that could have been asked this girl when she woke up could have been, where were you while all these people were working on your body? Now, this isn't as extreme, but we do this every night when we go to sleep. When we say we go to sleep, we have no idea where we go. Something in us detaches from impressions, all sensory impressions, and does what? Now, if someone shook us, we'd wake up. But then, when we go to sleep, we're clearly not fully attached to our bodies. When we wake up, if it's been a good sleep, we say, I slept really well. How do we know that? It's not just because of the symptoms that manifest. We say it immediately. I slept really well. What is it that knows that? And we can't easily answer that question. But what we do know is that just like we can't have a handless finger, we can't have a beingless body. Just like you can't have a handless finger, you can't have a body without being in it. But we can have bodiless being. This is what the wise tell us. This is what all the scriptures tell us. And this is what we aim for in those moments in our lives when we seek that condition of quiet, detached joy. Watching everything unfold like a play in a theatre. So being human depends on being. The glory of the human being is that the human bit is so built that it can take cognizance of the presence of being and unite with it. So being human depends on being. Now some people in some teachings say that this beingness depends on nothing, that the being has no dependency. But other teachings say that being itself is dependent on something which is beyond being. You with me here? Now that is incomprehensible. Whatever it is, it's unborn. Can't ever be born. It can't die. It's immutable, unchanging, universal, complete in itself, utterly, totally independent. Finger dependent on hand. Human dependent on being. Being dependent on independent being. You got it? It's a remarkable teaching. It's not complex. It sort of takes common sense and challenges us to realize that independentness. So these teachings say that's what we truly are. That's what I am. That's what you are. That's what the self is. Not a body, not a finger attached to a hand or a hand to a wrist or a wrist to an arm or an arm to a torso. Not a life force attached to a body. Not a particular being attached to a life force, dependent on the life force, but an independent, universal, utterly perfect being. This is the self that can never be detached from anything, because it's already perfectly detached. And the picture is completed when we realize that everything else exists within this self. There's a lovely observation from Billie Jean King, which some of you might be familiar with. She's a world #1 tennis player, female tennis player. She won 39 Grand Slams. At one point, she described playing tennis at world-class level when everything is going perfectly well, and this is what she said. It almost seems as though I'm able to transport myself beyond the turmoil on the court to some place of total peace and calm. I appreciate what my opponent is doing in a detached, abstract way, like an observer in the next room. It's a perfect combination of intense action taking place in an atmosphere of total tranquility. That's how Krishna advises Arjuna to fight on the battlefield. Without attachment, remaining untouched, as the lotus leaf is untouched by water. Now, what's he meant to be untouched by? Well, if we can take this at a very, very practical level in our own experience, what are the things that touch us in such a way that we're moved by their touch? So let's have a little look, instead of looking at detachment, let's have a little look at attachment and what it is. Now, like a Dyson vacuum cleaner, we've got loads of attachments. Have you ever tried to put one of those things together? Anyway. But instead of little pointy things that get into corners to suck up dust or round soft little brushes and all the rest, we're attached to all sorts of other things to ourselves. Things like, I'm the sort of person who never makes judgments. I notice that you're very judgmental. Stop it. I love chocolate. I couldn't live without it. There's an attachment. I'm the parent of an antisocial, tattooed goth with too many body piercings to count, and she used to be such a beautiful little girl who would run into my arms crying out, "Daddy, Daddy." I'm a brain surgeon, an accountant, a company director. Or I've just been fired. I. When that happens, our whole world can turn upside down. We're so strongly attached to a particular job that when we're forcibly detached from it, it feels like we've lost a lung or an arm or a purpose in life. But it's just a job. And we say, it's not a job to me, it's who I am. Well, no, you're not. The job depended on you, and now it doesn't. It depends on somebody else. It just depends on somebody else, not you. So are you going to cease to be if you don't have that job? You realize the truth of that and move on. The freedom that you can experience is profound. These are the standard everyday attachments that we've grown so accustomed to that we've started to believe these attachments are who or what we are. But no, we're not. They're just attachments. Some of them are important, some less important, but they're all just attachments. So then, is detachment simply a matter of getting rid of all our attachments? Well, if you get rid of all of the attachments on a Dyson vacuum cleaner, it's not going to be very good for its job, is it? So you can't physically remove the bits from a Dyson vacuum cleaner and still let it be a vacuum cleaner. And you can't physically remove the bits from a human being's existence and expect it still to be human. We have families, we have jobs to perform, duties to do, we have likes and dislikes. We've got all these things. It's a part of our kit. No, it's no point in, it's mad to try and just sort of get rid of them all. So the strategy that the teachings universally offer, a single strategy, is that you let go your personal claim on them. Let them operate, but let go the personal claim. There's a word used to describe this way to detachment, and that word is, I'm not going to use the English word actually, I'm going to use the Sanskrit word to start with, because we might have some ideas about the English word, but we won't know the Sanskrit word. So, Sanskrit word is vairagya. There's a different word in Greek, but we won't worry about that, we'll just stick with the Sanskrit. Vairagya. Vairagya is that power that gets awakened in us that allows us to let something go once we know it's got limits. Now remember when we were children and there were a number of attachments that we had, the things that would make us happy. Well, as we grow up, we lose those attachments because we know that they're not going to make us happy, and they're replaced by other things that we think are going to make us happy. And when we're grown-ups, we've got this whole catalogue of things that we think are going to make us happy, and we aim and target those things. And eventually, sooner or later, whether we like it or not, life has got this fabulous job of erecting brick walls for us. And we run into the brick wall, and we don't get through, so we step further back and run harder, and then step further back and run harder. And finally we wake up to the fact that, so we let go and walk around. So we've got these attachments, and vairagya is that power that gets awakened in the human being based on knowledge that frees them from their attachments. Once you know the limits of something, it automatically stops being attractive. It doesn't stick to you. So technically speaking, vairagya is the spirit of renunciation born of knowledge. The word I wasn't going to use was that word, renunciation. People have notions about a spiritual renunciate being somebody that adopts hair-lined cloths and lives in a cave somewhere, giving up the world. That's not what we're about. What we're about is knowledge that lets us be free of the things that we're attached to because we know their limits. That doesn't mean, for example, say we're attached to our husband or our wife. And in the name of freedom, you declare that you've enrolled in a philosophy course to renounce your attachment to them, and you've engaged a divorce lawyer to realise that detachment. The irony of that, of course, is that divorce deepens attachment in many ways rather than providing detachment. It increases attachment. No, vairagya is the knowledge that lets you stop being dependent on things around you. Attachment is born because you think you depend on this for happiness. When you realise that this thing is not going to give you the happiness that you want, the attachment dissolves, but the thing stays. So your entire wine cellar doesn't have to be hocked. You don't have to stop drinking hot chocolate. You don't have to stop having sex. None of the natural, normal pleasures of human existence are deprived of you. But your participation in them is measured against a different benchmark. Instead of measuring your participation in those activities according to the amount of happiness they bring you, you're on a different measure, a different benchmark. You're measuring your participation in those activities for one other purpose. And the glory of that is bliss for all. Joy for all. Peace for all. Now, this is a bit of a magic key. It is a fact that the discord in the world now is born of attachment, greed. The Middle East is a killing field where greed and attachment meets greed and attachment. And it may come to a point where a further physical engagement, like Krishna, is needed in order to dissolve the forces of greed and attachment like that. But what can we do here in our homes and in our working lives? Practice vairagya. Examine your attachments to see if they're really going to bring you the happiness that you think they are. And if they're not, let the attachment go. This is the panacea of peace in the world. It's the means to it, which is why Arjuna goes onto the battlefield of Kurukshetra, instructed by Lord Krishna to be unattached like a lotus leaf. Do your duty and do it perfectly. The notions about renunciation breed all kinds of weird ideas, and there's a lovely story in the tradition about a boy, a holy man's son, who heard about the Supreme Self, and he came home. His father asked him what he was going to do, so the son said, "The essence of all that I have learnt is that renunciation is the best medium for life, so I would like to go the way of renunciation." And the father thinks, "Oh, that sounds really excellent." So the boy decides he's not going to take up any activities at all. He's just going to sit in the house. He's not going to get a job. He's not going to go to work. He's not going to help in the household activities at all. He's just going to stay in the house, renouncing all activity. So after a little time, the father approaches him and asks him, has he really renounced everything? As far as the father could see, his son had renounced all work, but he still kept moving. He still kept eating, still kept using the amenities of the house. And the son said, "All right, okay, I'll renounce the house." So he left the house and went into the jungle and stayed there. And then after a period of time, the father went to see him again and asked him what the situation was. And the boy said, "Well, I can't say I've acquired complete peace, so clearly I haven't renounced everything yet." And the father said, "Yes, of course it seems so. Your renunciation isn't complete. Otherwise peace would have descended upon you." So the boy renounced the cloth that he wore. He gave up all food he ate, all activity, but he could never get any peace of mind. And finally he said, "The only thing that I can do now is renounce my body." So I'm going to do that. And he prepared a funeral pyre, intending to jump into it. His father suddenly appeared and asked him to be sure that this would be the final renunciation. The son said, "Once I've given up the body, what else will remain to bind me to worldly things?" And in this tradition, the father replied, "Your subtle body, my son, is not going to die. Not with your physical body. And the activities of the subtle body, which has got all these desires, will make it keep on wandering, and that activity will not subside after the body's burnt. You'll get another body. And when you're dead, you'll get another body because there'll be some desire there in your subtle body that needs to get expression. So burning the body is not the final answer. You're not going to get rid of this creation. And there's the bottom line. Forget about the notion of reincarnation. The notion of getting rid of the universe in order to be peaceful is based on a simple flaw of thinking. There you are in the universe. You list all the things that create agitation or a lack of peace in you. Your spouse, your children, your employer, the other people on the road, the person in the shop that didn't give you what you wanted, the mother-in-law, the father-in-law, all these interfering people. There they are. The only way in this thinking to have peace is to obliterate them all. And there you are, left totally alone and isolated in the universe, completely on your own. So it's madness. It's just madness. Now, the first thing the boy had to give up was something he was very attached to. So finally, in a fit of frustration, the boy says to the father, "So what should I do? If I can't renounce, what else can I do?" And the father said, "At last, you've asked me a question. So now it's possible for you to learn something." So the first thing the boy had to give up was thinking that he knew. Once he stopped thinking that he knew, he could ask a question and get some guidance. Our most strident attachments are either mind-born or heart-born. We think the sensory attachments are strong. These are the ones that can't be heard, seen, tasted, touched, or smelled. The mind-born attachments, the heart-born attachments. Because they're deeper, they're bodiless, almost invisible. They pass us by, except in our quiet times when we're by ourselves and we can't, for the dickens, come to rest. We just want some quiet, some peace of mind. And all of these heart-born attachments and mind-born attachments are singing a mutilated version of AC/DC's Thunderstruck, creating cacophony that we wouldn't believe. Thinking we know is mind-born. It gets really troublesome when we think we know better. And then it gets downright dangerous when we think we know best. No, we don't think we know best. We know best. Has anyone ever told you that they knew what you were thinking? Have you ever told anybody that you knew what they were thinking? Mind-born, unbased knowledge. But we know. We haven't got a clue about what somebody else is thinking. We just think we know. And thinking will create more things to know than knowledge will ever reveal. A universe of things to know, countless universes of things to know. Thinking can imagine them all. We're so deeply attached to what we think we know that we'll argue about it, create political parties for it, write books about it, force our children to learn it at school, and wage wars for it. All of it for want of really knowing. All because of attachment to things that we think we know. Heart-born attachments are even deeper. Love hardened by attachment is not love free and simple and true. It's said you become what you love. When you're attached, you cannot become the thing you're attached to because it's different from you. You're attached to it. And you cannot truly love the things to which you're attached because love is to love as essence is to essence, and the unloving cannot be loved. Attachments are not things that love you. You try to love them, but the love does not yield union. It rather causes division and fear of loss, whereas love has no fear of loss, none at all, because it is of itself, not of another thing. We say we love, but we want to be loved. We say we love, but require our love to be returned in equal measure. And we measure pretty precisely too. And if the measures are not to our liking, how quickly can that thing that we call love turn into hatred? So love itself is the purest expression of bare, naked detachment. Love itself is the purest expression of bare attachment. Bare detachment. Did I say attachment then? See? It's a good thing I'm listening to what I'm saying. So love itself is the pure expression of bare detachment. So coming back to Arjuna on the battlefield and us in our lives, how can we cultivate detachment? Well, we've got two ways open to us already. The way of knowledge and the way of love. The way of knowledge begins when we start to realize that we don't know it all. Now that's a paradox in many ways. That the way of knowledge can only begin when we realize that we don't know anything. Now, the person who can realize that they don't know anything is the strongest person in the world, not the weakest. Because in order to realize that you don't know anything, you must be a sovereign, independent, confident agent, self-dependent. I don't know. And look, your hands are open, your arms are open, you're ready to embrace. So it's real strength. The second way, the way of love, begins with simple unselfishness. It unfolds as selflessness and blossoms in the realization of the self of all, your unity with everybody. So it begins as simple unselfishness, unfolds as selflessness, and then is realized in the fullness of knowing that you are the self of all. The way of action brings those two together. We can learn to act selflessly. Act we must. We can't avoid it. We can't be free of it. But we can be free of attachments in the field of action. And it will make us infinitely more efficient. We can learn to act selflessly without looking for anything personal. In the heat of the moment, we can learn to let our attention be on the action itself, precisely on the action, watching it unfold with perfect detachment. Really full of care, full of intimate care for the action and all the actors involved in the activity, but free of any attachment to the fruits of the action or the action itself. Now this is philosophy as a way of life, and it's a magnificent way of life. It's a life of freedom. The freedom might not be experienced instantly, and it might be experienced in different ways, but it's a life of freedom. It's also a life where you become a citizen of the world, not a member of a particular class, culture, or nation. It's a life where you start to care for humanity as a whole, where even your smallest action ripples out in its influence to bring encouragement and nourishment to others. So for the philosopher, water off a duck's back, just letting agitations go, is child's play. It really is. Living like a lotus is the aim. That's the aim. So finally, on the battlefield of Kurukshetra, Arjuna asks about the signposts of a realized being of steady state. And Krishna describes such a being in chapter 2. In a number of verses towards the end of the chapter, and right at the end, he says that such a being is all-encompassing and embraces everything, having no attachment, no sorrow, pure, peaceful, and it passes into the next world without any turmoil in its own peaceful majesty. So we don't easily have access to a charioteer like Krishna to instruct us on our battlefields. But we have the company of one another in seeking a resolution to this and the realization of detachment. And that's really what a school of philosophy is for, to bring together those souls in eternity who have reached a point where they know that there are certain things that will not bring happiness and are open to discover those things that will bring happiness. Those people who, to some extent, have awakened the power of vairagya through knowledge and experience and are open to new knowledge for a life of freedom and peace. So it's a pretty broad topic, this detachment, and it dovetails very nicely with the unfolding of love as well, but also most singularly in its relationship to knowledge. Now we've got probably 7 or 8 minutes left if there's any questions that you would like to raise or any comments that you'd like to make. Yes, ma'am.
When you mentioned about running at the brick wall, I remember the old Goodies video that I saw years ago. They're all there and the door's locked, there's no key, they're bashing. And then the camera pans back and there's just a door and there's nothing around.
Did we all hear that? Yeah.
It came to me clearly, because often I rush into things. And when I can step back, I can see that there's just a door and there's lots of space around it.
The stepping back is everything, isn't it? But it's not so easy sometimes to step back because we've got this stickiness. This word, asakti, where is it? Anasakti yoga is the yoga of non-attachment. This word, asakti, literally means sticky. Anasakti is non-sticky. So asakti is sort of like araldite in Sanskrit. It's real sticky stuff. And the fact is that everything is full of stickiness. Your senses have a natural tendency to stick to sense objects. So the dissolution of the glue comes through knowing what the limit is. Not destroying the object, but just knowing what the limit is. Is there anything else? Yes, ma'am.
I wondered if you could expand upon what you were talking about, the battles that are going on in the Middle East and so on, and saying how really we can't sort of do anything as individuals at that level, but how can we just amongst ourselves try and make a difference in those areas given the limitations?
Well, the worst thing that you could do is commission a specially built soapbox. That would be the worst thing to do. The only transformative agency in the world at any time is that being who is what he knows or she knows to be true. So become your very best self. but literally, without compromise. Take counsel. Seek the company of others who are making that same effort. Participate in an inquiry into the nature of truth. Meditate. Meditate. But a proper meditation. A real meditation that has a lineage, an authority that can support you. Become your very best self. There's no other way. And if we want to help the situation in the Middle East, and our hands are limited in what they can do. We can't sort of fly over and drop down care packages, but we can be our best self. And the lovely thing is that if we try to be our best self for those people, the power that comes to us to be our best selves comes from all those people. And it's not just a personal matter. So it's a marvellous, marvellous way to deal with it. But never forgetting them. But being your best self and proceeding, living a life like that for the rest of your life. So that when it comes in your deathbed, somebody can be there and they say that you lived a life well examined. That's not asking too much, is it? And what dignity it gives you too. What else? Anything else? Yes, Sam.
I think you partially answered it, but I'm wondering about practical tips around renunciation. So one that comes to mind for me is neti sort of thing. So yeah, you can expand on that.
You know, it actually starts in the moment that you find a rising attachment coming up. And the first sort of instinctive impulse is to try and get rid of it. Neti. But look, let it come into the light a little bit. Have a look at it. The words neti aren't meant to be a magical... This Sanskrit phrase means not this, and it appears in one of the most important parts of the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad as a single teaching for breaking free. And what it basically means is, I am not this, I am not this. And the realization comes that I am all this. But you can't just use it like a magic incantation. So let the attachment come out into the light. Let it be examined. Because often we can use spiritual exercises like neti to postpone effort, to keep it quietly in the dark, putting a nice little pink, smoky, spiritual shawl over it, ring a couple of crystal bells, and light some incense. So bring it out into the light a little bit. Yes, sir?
So another way that you might, at least when I speak, is to say that one should be rational and objective in one's thoughts. And that therefore, in acting in that manner, emotion which otherwise might rule us in a manner that creates discontent become minimized. But taken to its extreme, one becomes a robot. So where do you get the balance?
Right, lovely. Well, firstly, you speak to your wife. I'm really glad you raised that, because this notion of detachment as a sort of a rational, cold, analytical process couldn't be further from the truth. One of the greatest descriptions of detachment that's ever been written in the Western world was written by St. John of the Cross in a rhapsody of complete love. Meister Eckhart wrote a treatise on detachment in the midst of mystical union with the God that he conceived of. So detachment's not meant to be rational, analytical, objective. It can't happen without love. The transformative power of attachment can't be awakened without love. So you're not simply analysing things in order to be removed from them and not touched by them. You're practicing the renunciation of attachment to things so that they can be themselves, untouched by you. So you're doing it for love.
I don't understand what you mean by that.
Do you have a child? Son? How old, can I ask? How old is he? 16. He's about to detach himself from you, isn't he? And you love him, don't you? You know? But you do love him, don't you? And you won't ever stop loving him, will you? And that love is allowing you to let him go, isn't it?
Not necessarily.
Is the love causing you to stay holding on to him?
I think there's something to be said for attachments. I don't think that divorce of an attachment is actually necessary in all circumstances a positive thing.
Attachments themselves aren't destructive if they're free of your personal identification with them.
That's what defines an attachment often.
Well, it might be the case that attachment, stickiness, is a natural part of the way things go on. And this personal identification with it is a superimposition over the top of it. So the first thing in your rational, objective effort to understand attachment might be to rationally, objectively examine the notion of your identification with the things you're attached to. I mean, if I were to ask you now, and I'm not going to expect that you answer this, but if I were to ask you now, what is the one thing in your life that defines you now? What would you say? You don't have to answer that. But if you can identify that and examine whether that definition of you really is as life-giving, as liberating, as freeing, as magnifying as you'd like it to be, then it might allow you to be able to distinguish between the stickiness and the identification with it. It's a fine distinction, but here's the hoot. Once you do make the distinction, it's not fine at all. It's like, there's this huge fence in front of you, and you've got to climb over it, and you climb over it, and climb over it, and climb over it, and finally you get onto the other side and look back, and by some false illusion, that huge fence is only an inch high. But the way forward is through the continued inquiry. There's no easy answer to that, and each individual has got to find it for himself. There's no point in you and I banging on about our opinions about attachment here, but the inquiry is everything. Is that all right? Is that all right? Okay. We have to draw this to a close, I think. Now is time to stop, so we're stopping for lunch. Thank you very much. But before we do finish, rather than applause, I'd be very, very pleased if you were happy to let this gratitude for this as I'm most grateful to be asked to come here and speak, because, of course, when you do something like this, you learn more than what you knew before. Knowledge just opens up, so I'm most grateful to have done that. And together with you, I'd like to offer up the fruits of this conversation and all that follows from it for the good of all. So just as we are now, bring the mind into the present moment through the agency of the body. The body is here in the present. It can't be anywhere else. So let the mind anchor itself on the body through the sense of smell, nothing in particular, just be aware of the sense of smell. Taste, touch, sight, hearing. Let the mind be still, like a lake. Any superficial movements, let them come to pass. Any movements from deep below, let them come, but let them pass. Until the surface is still. And with the heart open, may all that has arisen from this flow from this same stillness, through this same stillness, for this, seated in the hearts of all. And with that, we make our way to lunch. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you.